All right, well, let's get stuck into it. We've got about 20 folks and we're a couple of minutes in, so let's go. All right, welcome. I'm Lindsay. My co-organizer, Michael, is lurking in the background somewhere. I would like to welcome you to this month's Sydney DevOps Meetup. I'd like to firstly acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the country throughout Australia, which in my case is the Darkinjung people, and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded and treaties have never been signed. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Well, as I said, thank you very much for coming along to the August meetup. It is lovely to have you all in here, particularly given the lockdown that I assume a lot of us are under at the moment. So basically, if you live in Australia at the moment, you're pretty much guaranteed to be in a lockdown. So enjoy. I'm glad that we could spice things up a little bit with continuing to do these meetups and have a bit of that professional sort of connection and community here. And even though we're all doing it pretty tough at the moment. Just a quick reminder of our code of conduct. So we don't tolerate harassment of meetup participants in any form. So all communication should be appropriate for a professional audience. And please remember that harassment, sexist, racist, or exclusionary jokes are not appropriate at DevOps Sydney. Nice thing about doing these meetups online is that it's really easy to boot people out. Haven't needed to do that until now, but there's always a first time. But let's keep rolling. So tonight's agenda, we've got the intro, which is the thing that I'm doing right now. We're going to do a quick events and jobs section pretty much straight away because we have a single talk tonight. And that is going to be Jesse talking about, there we go, I've got the slides out of the wrong order. We've got Jesse talking about automating infrastructure governance with Azure policy, which is going to be really great to see. So as a bit of a preamble for the jobs section, the way that this works is that if you are looking to fill a position, either you're hiring or you're looking to be hired, you're going to have about 30 seconds to be able to give your pitch. So if you could just open up the chat if you're interested in giving a pitch in a minute or so, and just pop a message in there, just letting me know, or any of the reactions in the newer versions of Zoom if you're using that, just to give me a heads up that you're looking to talk about a particular job or looking to be hired. So yeah, you'll have about 30 seconds to do that. All right. So until we get to that, though, who here is a first timer at the DevOps meetup, the Sydney DevOps meetup specifically? Sure, you've all been to other DevOps meetups, but quick show of hands.
Yep.
Hey, we've got a couple virtual and physical hands. That is great to see. Normally when I ask this question of how far away have you come from, normally because we do it in person in Sydney, there'll be an occasional person that's not from there, but this, like doing it on Zoom, it sort of levels the playing field a bit. So is there anybody from outside Sydney that's here at the meetup tonight? Well, I'm going to go first. I don't actually live in Sydney and haven't lived in Sydney almost the entire time that I've been running the meetup. Well, there's a hand there. I've got a hand from AK and from VJ. Anybody from outside of Australia? Oh, one from Sophie as well. Fantastic. And feel free to throw in the chat if you're coming from a bit further afield. Oh, we've got Mark coming in from Canberra. That is lovely to see you here. All right, anybody from outside Australia? Oh, we've got more people that are joining as well, so maybe they're up for it. All right, well, it is lovely to have you all here, regardless of where you are coming from. All right, so the main talk for tonight is not this one. So apparently the old slide is still cached in there, which is great. But the online meetups are going to continue until 2022. So the only way through the lockdown that we're in right now is by getting vaccinated. So if you haven't gotten vaccinated, the easiest way to do that if you're in Australia is through HotDoc. I strongly recommend you do it as quickly as possible because Delta is not going to be stopping anytime soon. So that is my public service announcement for this evening. Events as well before we jump into jobs. So there's a DevOps Days that well, on paper is happening on October 28th and 29th in Melbourne. I hope it goes ahead, but who really knows at this point? We've also got the P99 conference, which is all around availability and performance. And so that's happening. It's an online event on October 6th and 7th. So you can find more information about that at p99conf.io. We've also got SneakCon, which is happening on October 5 and 7. Again, that's another online event. It's sort of wild that given the complete availability of days and time, given a lot of us are in lockdown, that there are two pretty great conferences that are scheduled for literally the same time. But, that's the world that we live in, I guess. So if you're interested in the application security side of things, I definitely recommend heading along to that. What else have we got? We've got HashiConf Global as well, that's happening on October 19 to 20. And it's another online event. So pretty much all of these have got different live streaming with chats and whatnot that are happening. So even if you're not able to physically be in there, you're still able to sort of participate with the speakers and other attendees. So if you're using anything in the HashiCorp ecosystem, definitely recommend checking this out as well. All right, let's jump into jobs. So we've got a couple of people that have popped their hands up. We've got Stephen and Ella, who have both mentioned that they are looking to hire. So Stephen, happy to go for you to go first if you want to unmute and talk about the hiring that you're doing.
Yeah, cool. Hi, everyone. So I'm Stephen, work from Skyfi, and we do a lot of Terraform and DevOps. We have about 250 servers, and we're looking to help. So we're a global data platform and expanding into new markets. I might just put in a little link in the to full job description in the chat.
Yeah, fantastic. So my recommendation there is pop the job description in the chat if you've got a link to it. And for the folks that aren't here or don't catch it in the chat, just pop it on the Meetup event page as well as a comment so people are able to find it afterwards. Thanks, Stephen. We've also got Ella, who is looking to hire as well. Ella, go nuts.
Hi, how are you?
Not too bad. Your audio is a little bit rusty, but we'll see how we go. Not sure if we can hear you or not. Yeah, I don't think we can hear you. I'm sorry, Ella. Maybe try, turning it off and on again is the nasty thing to say, but
I had issues. Can you hear me now?
That's great. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I've had issues this morning with it. Who knows why? So I work for a company called Talita. We are a startup tech company that deal with computer vision. So if you at all have been in Woolworths and you put your produce on the scales and all of a sudden pops up everything, that's what we do. So we're looking for a link. I can see on your screen. Got some really cool products that we've got in the pipeline. We're looking for someone who's really enthusiastic to come on board and help us to develop amazing products.
Okay.
So I'll pop the description, a link to LinkedIn.
Colin's good.
Colin. Yeah, and I hope to speak to some people.
You want help?
Fantastic, awesome. Thank you, Ella. So feel free to pop it in the chat and on the Meetup event page as well, so people are able to find it after the fact.
Awesome, thank you.
No worries. Glad we were able to get that audio issue sorted out as well. All right, anybody else that is looking to hire or be hired? Big sigh there from whoever is unmuted, but I feel you right now. All right, well, in which case, let's just keep rolling. We're going to go straight into the talk now. We've got Jesse talking about automating infrastructure governance with Azure policy. I'm going to stop sharing, and Jesse, feel free to take over.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Lindsay. This is going to be very unscripted and okay, here we go.
That's looking great.
Yeah, I'll zoom in a bit. So forewarning, I tried to get all my different browsers and sites on dark mode. I have had feedback before about this kind of recorded video, how to session not being very user friendly if everything's in the default light mode, because people view things at crazy times at night these days. So all my CLI, Visual Studio, Azure, and GitHub, Microsoft Docs, that's all dark mode. The only one I couldn't do is this external site that I really want to show you guys because it's super exciting. And yeah, let me kick off some slide decks. So today's session is something I have talked about before in the past, forewarning. So some things, some content is not fresh. Apologies if it is a bit outdated, if you are really in tune with Azure policy and governance in the cloud. But yeah, I'll try and keep it going and also give updates as well as to what's the latest with this space. So yeah, my name is Jesse Ludon. I work at Lab 3, who are Melbourne-based in Australia. They're a big upcoming services provider, product provider, very high up there with Microsoft partners in Australia. I do a lot of Azure and DevOps there, and yeah, I'm basically very in touch with Azure policy, if I could say that. Like, I live and breathe it every day. Even sort of outside of work, I don't mind working on Azure policy sort of governance related stuff, JSON wrangling, as I've called it before. If anyone knows JavaScript object notation with Azure policy, it is a bit of a headache. It's not intuitive, but yeah, it is challenging. So I hope to really give you some insights here as to what's happening in the trenches in a way, and kind of save you some headache and save you some time as well. And so really I like going through this kind of high level overview of the ecosystem of Azure policy straight up initially, just to give you like a sense of what's all the different components and tools and where to go if you want to look at examples of Azure policy code. So there's definitely Microsoft Docs, of course, that are available, and different repos in GitHub, official repos and sort of community repos as well. Tooling wise, there's plenty of different tools you can use, different languages as well. So PowerShell is a very common one to manage Azure policies. I've done some Terraform stuff, Bicep. And if you really know Azure policy, you'll also know it actually relies heavily on ARM templates within the policies themselves. So definitely, ARM templates are a very good one to know and keep up to date with. Very, very powerful. And they're kind of, that first class infrastructure as code language with Microsoft. Bicep is the new DSL that everyone's talking about. Basically just, makes it easier to deploy ARM templates and JSON there. So on the right here, you can see some numbers here. So these are stats I pulled out from the AZ Advertiser site, which is actually developed by a Microsoft employee called, I can't remember his name, but I'll show you in a bit. Yeah, so it's a community-driven site, and basically it's a one-stop shop for all the stats related to Azure policies. So there's over 1,300 generally available policy definitions that you can use out of the box today. About 90 preview policy definitions, and the staggering number here is really the number of policy aliases, and I'll get more in depth with this as I talk about it, because it's really I see it as the real power that drives policy automation and compliance and governance in Azure. These policy aliases are, if you know about the domain naming service, so DNS, they're basically a mapping so that the policy engine can find the specific property within the resource JSON. So as you're provisioning, or someone else in the team, or someone else who has access to the cloud is provisioning a resource to Azure, the policy alias that's looked at from the definition will actually map that alias to a specific property in that resource JSON. So that makes it very, very scalable and easy to to create these definitions, which basically, apply compliance to your environments. So there's 98 namespaces. So what are namespaces? They are they're basically resource namespaces. So things like Microsoft Compute, Microsoft Storage. The biggest namespace that I found through looking at these stats is actually Microsoft.network. So that means all your load balancers, virtual networks, gateways. These account for the largest number of aliases today, which is not really surprising, because if you think about governance and security, the network in your cloud is kind of like the edge. So that's usually your entry point to a lot of sensitive data. So it does make sense that Microsoft would invest heavily in providing aliases so you can manage the network side of things within your cloud. Cool. So I do have other slides, but I don't want to do death by PowerPoint in this one. So I'm going to switch over to my demo environment. I have a couple demos I do want to show you quickly. So in my sort of lab, by the way, this resource visualizer that I've just noticed in the portal is super, super cool. I think it's just recently been released to different tenants, but it basically gives you a high level overview of different resources that are in resource groups. So I deployed a development infrastructure resource group in my subscription, and I have a critical infrastructure resource group as well, with similar resources as you've seen here. And what I want to show you is how we can use Azure Policy deploy if not exist effects to automate some governance and some monitoring configuration that we may want to do at scale, right? And how you do that with the Terraform and kind of JSON wrangling as well. But so the infrastructure here I've set up in advance. I don't want to bore you with doing all this groundwork. What I also set up, if I can show you, is I've set up two log analytics workspaces. So I've got one called performance logs, another called security logs, and I've also set up, actually I'll show you the resource. So I've also set up four data collection rules. Some of you who are using Azure today may have gotten an email recently from Microsoft within the last 24 hours about the Azure Monitor agent becoming GA or becoming more prevalent with your logging infrastructure and monitoring infrastructure. So, if traditionally you would have deployed the MMA agent, Microsoft Monitoring Agent. So what I've done, these data collection rules are actually the part of this new Azure Monitor Agent. So I've set them up in advance to cover both operating system types, Linux and Windows. And what I've done through policy, using built-in policies that are available today, I've actually deployed that as code with my GitHub module that I have. And it is a publicly available GitHub module. So if you go to global bal Azure Policy as code with dashes in between, you'll see all the code there that I've worked on for past talks. And this one really has a mix of Bicep and Terraform. They don't do exactly the same thing. I am kind of looking at how I can make that more reusable in terms of actual configuration. Right now, they're very opinionated and they do very separate policies. But today we're going to look at Terraform. And what I can show you is, so I have a number of assignments. One of these assignments is the logging governance assignment. So this contains the policies that I've specifically set up for today, again, to deploy the Azure Monitor Agent and also configure the data collection rule. So one of the assignments I've actually scoped to the development infrastructure resource group. And the other assignment, I've scoped to the entire subscription. So this is something you can do with policy out of the box through policy assignments. You can apply that assignment to different scopes. That way you can have, more governance at scale, or if in particular for testing and development, you probably want to apply that to a lower scope, such as a resource group. So it's certainly possible to do that. And I've shown that to you here. And if you wanted to look at a definition view in terms of what's in these assignments, I'll just swap to the definition screen here. So these are all my custom definitions that I've deployed as code with Terraform. And you can see they're organized into a definition type called, I'll just zoom in, initiative. So initiative is Microsoft's word for policy set, which is a grouping of policies. So common policies, common use case, common goal, group those into initiatives and then assign those initiatives to your desired scope, subscription level, management group level, resource group level, etc. So for today's demo, I've done a new initiative for logging governance for development specifically, and a new initiative for the same thing for production, same number of policies. I think the parameters are pretty much the same. So, but I wanted to show you how we can manage this as code. And I've also done some initial remediation. So remediation with Azure Policy is specifically for existing resources. So as you assign policies to your environment, there's existing resources that will probably be non-compliant, right? That's why you're using policies in the first place, I think. And remediation is there so you can actually automate and trigger the actual policy effect. So if a policy is deploying the Azure Monitor agent, in our case, this remediation task would actually go and complete that deployment for you to any non-compliant resources. So I've gone through that. I did run into a few failures, as you can see here, but largely it was successful. So that means if I go to my, so I ran that on development, by the way. If I go to my development infra, look at the activity log. This is the development resource group. I should see, yeah, there we go. So I've got a number of deploy if not exist policy actions. This is the automation. These are the automation capabilities that are possible with a policy that has a nested ARM template to do a deployment, such as the Azure Monitor agent. And so you can see here it succeeded. There's roughly, I think, 2 virtual machines in this resource group. So if I look at, for example, dev VM1 here, we can see under extensions, there we go. So I've got an Azure Monitor, Microsoft Azure Monitor type resource that's been provisioned and it's succeeded. So that was kicked off by our policy. And now that that is there, the policy is going to mark this resource as compliant. So it knows that, this resource has been deployed. It doesn't need to run another remediation task. And in terms of the data collection rules, so at the moment, I don't know if they have data collection rules available to view within the virtual machine view, but where we can find where they're configured is if I go to Monitor, Azure Monitor, go to data collection rules. So these are the 4 that I've set up, 2 for each sort of operating system type. And the cool thing about data collection rules, this is a bit off topic, but it's good to notice, mention, is you can multi-home your resources to different log analytics workspaces. So that, I think that was hard to do with the MMA. Data collection rules make it really, really easy. So if I look at, say, Windows performance logs here, I've got 1 connected resource, 1 data source, and that was set up by my policy. So as I provision new virtual machines to my subscription, the policy is basically going to see that the virtual machine is non-compliant if it's missing a data collection rule and it's a Windows VM, right? So that's as dynamic as it gets. The data source here is a performance counter. So that's basically making sure, performance logs and everything are sent to my log analytics workspace that I showed you just a few minutes ago. So let's look at, now that I've shown you kind of like the sort of Azure portal infrastructure view of what's happened, I will dive into some code. So just for anyone watching, I am using Terraform version 1.3. Not sure if it is, yeah, it's not the latest. So it is 1.5, which is the latest. I don't think I need to update, but maybe I will later. So right now I'm on Azure RM version 2.72 as well. And I run a couple of plans, so we don't need to waste time with doing new changes right now. I just want to walk you through this code so you understand from a Terraform HashiCorp language perspective how this all fits together. So with Terraform in my module here, this public module, I've got my main file where I've got all the module calls. I'm actually using submodules to manage these policy resources. So if I zoom in here, all my policy assignments are in their own folder. Definitions and policy sets are kind of split up like that. I have done other kind of patterns where I've put all the resources just in a single, main root folder. That was fine, and there was a lot less. Stuffing around with like variables, passing outputs and inputs between modules. If you're familiar with Terraform, this is what I'm stuck with now because that's what I started with. But maybe in the future I will look to refactor this. So from main we've got different module calls. I've got my custom policy definitions in this policy definitions folder, and what it looks like if you've never seen an Azure policy defined as HashiCorp language, it's really a mix. And this is interesting to get your head around, because if you've worked with Terraform or HashiCorp language, you know how easy it is. It's kind of like this up here where you can see name, policy type, mode. There's no brackets. There's no commas you need to put in. It's pretty user friendly. And then look at down here. So this is where it gets into sort of policy JSON. So it's really like a hybrid, if I can call it that. Like when you're working with policies in HashiCorp language, this kind of setup that I'm running here, where I've got the definition in a Terraform file, it's really a hybrid, right? And this has tripped me up a few times. Just maybe I missed a comma or something like that. You can see, here's a comma here. Maybe I missed a quotation mark, something like that. So just be aware of that. I don't think the validation. So if I was to run a Terraform validate, it would say everything's good. Now, if I went back to that policy, and maybe if I took away that comma, which is absolutely critical. I mean, deployment of that policy would fail, I think, because I'm missing that comma. I don't think the Terraform validate would pick that up because it's a JSON thing. Terraform is it's right here. It's saying the HashiCorp language is good. So there's nothing to worry about there. So there you go. Configuration is valid. But I know for a fact that comma is absolutely critical. So this is a custom policy that you see here, and the schema for it is publicly available. You can find that online, or just look at examples of other policies in GitHub. Also, Microsoft Docs. Wow, Microsoft Docs is like a really great resource for Azure policy. If you haven't been there, check it out. There's plenty of different sort of high level and low level documentation on Azure policy, everything from how to understand how to create policies from the beginning and how to scope them and the structure as well. So I've definitely gone back to this site at least 1,000 times, I think. And so if you don't know anything, I think first point of call is Microsoft Docs, then look at, examples in the field and work your way in sort of in that sense. Now, I just want to draw your attention as well to, because I mentioned resource aliases before and how they're really the backbone of Azure policy. So this bit right here where it says the effect and then the details, and within the type key, you've got a value here that says Microsoft.authorization/locks. So this policy, it actually looks at what locks have been configured on different resource types. And this is actually a good example of an alias, a resource alias in the Microsoft authorization namespace. And this maps to a specific property on a lock. And that's that way, we can then look at the locks level as well, and actually look at whether these the lock level is configured to read only or delete. And this is a really good example of what you can do with just auditing different resources for various levels of configuration with policy. And I know this JSON is, the first time I saw this, I was thinking, okay, that's a lot to process. But once you've done a few custom policies and you've seen it work, I kind of like look at this in 2 seconds and I can see, okay, it's got a single if statement here and a single sort of then area here. And it's looking at, I'm looking for this type section here as to what resource it's actually auditing. And then I'll go into more details within the existence condition in this example. And then parameters is where we can actually, make our policies reusable. So here's a parameter example where there's a parameter defined for resource types, and it's an array. So there's multiple values in this array. These are all the networking resource types that we want to scan our environment to see what sort of lock is configured, whether it's a read-only lock or a cannot delete lock. And that's all done through this basically hybrid HashiCorp language JSON definition, right? Let me show you an example of a deploy if not exist policy, which is really the automation capability out of the box with policy. So here's a metric alert policy. So I created this to create a metric alert for an app gateway, application gateway, and it deploys a metric alert and configures some out of the box alert for CPU utilization, right? So the difference between this deploy if not exists policy and the one I just showed you that audits the locks is really in the then statement area. So the initial bit where it's an if, you can think of that as this is the qualification. This is policy qualifying. Is my resource what I want to govern and look for? And in this case, it's an app gateway. So resources that get created and updated in Azure, when they meet this condition in the if statement, that then goes into the following policy evaluation, which is this then statement here. So you don't need to worry too much about much of this. I know it's pretty verbose. Let me turn on word wrap. What you do need to know with this kind of deployment policy where it's deploying a resource that's non-compliant is that there's a nested ARM template within the policy itself. So this deployment part, if you're familiar with ARM templates, there's basically a template here that's going to deploy a metric alert. And, when I was coming up with this, I'd look at ARM templates for metric alerts and say, okay, that looks like it's doable. We can parameterize some of these variables, surface that up to a policy, and also look at what's our non-compliant policy look like. So in this case, the important thing to know is for non-compliance, you want to really craft this existence condition here as well as you possibly can, really, because so each one of these conditions needs to be met and equal to true for the resource or app gateway in this case to be marked as compliant. And if it's not marked as compliant, it will keep coming up and getting triggered for remediation of the resource, right? And interesting enough, I did run into some built-in policies recently for diagnostic settings for Azure Kubernetes service, where the existence condition, they had some statically coded, like static values here for what it was looking for. And the problem with that was it also had parameters where you could change those values. So when you change the parameters of what diagnostic settings were being applied through the policy, the existing condition never equal to true because of those statically coded settings there. So that was a bit annoying, but to get around that, work around that, I created a custom policy, changed the existence condition to a parameter, the same parameter that you would change to change the diagnostic settings. And after that, I was all good. And I got 100% compliance every time, which was great after making the remediation work. So that's a deploy if not exist policy in a nutshell. So you might be thinking now, okay, so you've seen some policies in Terraform. How do you actually apply that? The recommended way, so you can deploy just policy definitions and assign them any way you want. The recommended way is to use a policy set, or initiative. So in Terraform and in ARM templates, they are referred to policy sets. In a lot of Microsoft documentation, they are initiatives. So I love that confusion, makes things interesting. So here in my code, I've got a number of policy set definitions, which are initiatives, right? Let me collapse this so you can see the bird's eye view. So I've got monitoring governance. These are all initiatives. Monitoring governance, tag governance, in IAM, identity and access management, security governance, data protection governance, logging governance for dev, and logging governance for prod. So these are the two that I created just for today's demo. Now, so remember that these initiatives are groups of common policies. So let me go to the logging governance for dev. Okay, so this is, right. So this is the one for dev. And you can see again, it's kind of a hybrid HashiCorp language, JSON. Here we're passing in policy definition references using a data source lookup. This is a dynamic block. If you're familiar with Terraform, these are super, super useful for basically not repeating yourself if you don't have to. So here I'm doing a for each using a data source lookup, which grabs a number of built-in policies that I want to bring into this policy set. And here I've done the definition reference, which brings in a built-in policy. So you can see the ID there. And I've actually set a reference ID name. So this, I don't know if you know, but this reference ID property in Terraform, it is available in ARM templates, of course, and Bicep as well. This is super, super useful for controlling what the reference name of your policy appears as. And you use that many times over, like when you're doing a policy exemption or you're doing custom deny messages, you have to point to a reference ID. And if that reference ID is something, like a GUID, super hard to remember, it's super hard to link that back to what the policy is actually doing. So I like to put the reference ID for all my custom policy sets and initiatives as the actual display name of the policy there. And that's what I've done here, and here as well, and here as well. So, that's going to help you later on. And I'll show you where I use that as well with the exemptions. So here I've got a bunch of different built-in policies, and I'm passing in a data collection resource ID. That's one of the parameters to configure these virtual machines to point to the resources that I've already set up in advance. So these are policy sets, right? Okay. So even after creating that, you still need to assign it. So I've got a policy assignments. Let me close that. I've got a policy assignments module here. Here's all my policy assignments. Again, it's another resource. And if I look at the dev assignment here, I don't know if you know, but there is a new resource type available for policy assignments with Terraform. So I'm using the new one. It's resource group policy assignment. Previously, there was just one type of policy assignment resource. Now they've split it up into, I believe, 4. So if you're going to assign to a resource group like I have here, you need to change to the new resource type for that. If you're on a certain version of Azure RM provider, because eventually it will get deprecated, the old resource type. So this is my login governance for development. It's actually scoped to a resource group, and the identity is a system assigned identity. So this is important when you need to deploy resources through policy. It actually needs permissions. Those permissions come from a system assigned managed identity that gets created with the policy assignment. Now there's 2 parts to this. There's the actual policy assignment resource. And if I open this Terraform file I have called role assignments, there is actually a role assignment resource as well. If you click ops the policy assignment within the portal, this role assignment is created for you. But because we're doing this as code and we want to, make this as reusable and scalable as possible, we need to create these role assignments through code as well. So this is how I've done it. There's one role assignment per Azure policy assignment, and it actually looks up the principal ID of the policy assignment there. So after that policy assignment is created and the system managed identity is created, it gets that, it gets the ID of that and then creates the role assignment there. And I had to put in a skip service principal check here, otherwise there may be some delay with when new policy assignment identities get created. This actually solves that problem there. So policy assignments, the kind of last stage of getting something in Azure through code. Now, basically from my main file in Terraform, this is what you might call a parent Terraform file. So I've got all those resources mapped out there, and I have to pass in some of these IDs from different modules. So this is how I've done it. I've created variables in different modules where I've needed to bring in values from, such as the policy set ID from my policy set module. And for my custom policies that I'm creating in my policy definitions module, I've got a variable here called custom policies monitoring governance. So I've got different variables that are defined in that policy set definition. This is how I found that it's, I guess, the least amount of effort if I'm adding new policy definitions, custom ones, and I want to map that into a policy set. I could do a data source lookup after the custom definition is created, or I could use the policy ID for that resource directly through this mapping method. And I think I like this method better. I think it has less delay and it builds some sort of dependency between those resources there because they're all kind of being created and managed from the same repo. So how this works is in my policy set definitions module, I have a list map string variable for different custom policies. And so this is for tags. This is for identity and access management. This is for Sentinel monitoring governance. So if I'm creating custom policy definitions, I'll create a single sort of variable list map string, which will hold all the policy definitions for that sort of category. And then I'll bring in the inputs of all the resource IDs, which I then use to create the policy sets and initiatives. And this is really cool as well. If you haven't seen it, a built-in, so this variable here is called built-in policies, IAM governance. It's a list any type. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm putting in all the built-in policy names. And then later on, I think, yeah, here we go. So down here, I've got a data source lookup, which is dynamic, and it's based on how many built-in policy names I put in that variable. So then goes and looks at those existing resources which are in Azure, which I want to use for my custom definitions and custom initiatives in code, and it gets the resource IDs for me. And so, if you remember my dynamic blocks here, these are looking at, where's an example of it? Here's an example. These are looking at the data source lookup, and it pulls in the ID of those built-in policies. And it sets the reference ID to display name. So that's something super, super cool. I hope if you're using Terraform policy as code, you have something similar to this, because hard coding resource IDs in your code is just painful. I don't wish that torture on anyone, and it makes it really hard to read the code as well. So, so that's kind of like a code overview. What I haven't shown you is exemptions. So I've actually used a custom Terraform module to manage exemptions for this demo, and I've created an exemption. I'll show you it in the portal. So what is an exemption? An exemption is a new sort of policy resource. When you create assignments and you're managing governance for your environments, subscriptions, management groups, there will come a time for sure, 100%, that you need to exempt a certain resource or a resource group from your governance. Maybe, and this has happened to me before, at that time, I didn't have exemptions. What I had to do was pass in a not scope value in the policy assignment. So I have an example of that here. So not scope is basically saying, okay, with this policy assignment, I want to exclude a number of one or more resource groups from the entire assignment. So from the entire compliance that I've set from this assignment, right? So that's not scopes. That was there for a very long time, and I've used that before. The problem with that is it's very inflexible, and if you wanted to remove that exemption using not scopes, you'd have to come into the code, and you'd have to update the code to remove the resource group within this list here or array. Now with exemptions, what you can do is you can have a expiry time for the exemption. So the same thing, I can exempt, and here I've exempted my critical infrastructure resource group from one of the production assignments. So you can have an expiry time for this exemption, which is super, super cool. And you can also have some metadata attached to the exemption as well. And not only that, but with exemptions, you can selectively exclude certain policies from a policy set or an initiative. So if I wanted to say exclude for that resource group, all the Azure Monitor Agent and data collection rule policies. So maybe I wanted to stagger the deployment of that. I could do that through an exemption quite easily. And this also is where the reference ID comes in. So see how, let me zoom in. See how these reference IDs here have, some of them have brackets. So Windows security log, Windows performance log. So this is what I've custom put in as code. And these four reference IDs are the built-in policy reference IDs there. And where that matters is when you're doing the exemption through code, you can bring in that same value here within this policy definition reference ID. So these are excluding these certain policies within that initiative from this exemption from the resource group that we are exempting. Okay, so let's try and actually do something here. So in compliance, if I have a look at the compliance state for my infra, and okay, so I've got a number of policies here. Development is 100% compliance because I run that. Logging governance production. So this is my, remember this is my my initiative I've assigned to the entire subscription. Now you can see here, there's a number of policies that are exempt. So that's managed through my code. These are all the deploy if not exist policies. And there's one, looks like there's one storage account that's missing diagnostic settings. Okay, so I haven't made any changes to the resources within my critical infrastructure resource group. But I want to show you how this exemption works. So when you exempt some policies for a certain scope, you'll see that there's an exempt compliance state coming there, and the total resources, it's greater than 1 because I have actual Windows and Linux virtual machines and possible non-compliant resources in that scope within the subscription. So I definitely have something there, but I cannot run remediation on those resources right now because they are exempt, right? So if I try and run that from the portal, it'll say 0 resources selected. So why don't we remove some of these exemptions for certain things like Linux machines, right? So what I'll do is I'll update this exemption, remove all the exemptions for specific policies relating to Linux. And I will run I'll run an apply if I can. Didn't have that in my history. Yeah, so Terraform apply is going to basically take my change and I put in auto approve because I don't want to see the plan. It's basically going to hopefully apply that new exemption, updated exemption. So within the policy assignment, my resource group for critical infrastructure can then receive the remediation for all the Linux changes. That's going to take some time. Let me show you as well. So this repository I'm working from, it's in GitHub. What I've done as well, I've been working from a branch and I've done a pull request with all the changes from today. And there's a couple tests here that have run using GitHub Actions. Interesting enough, it posts, I've just copied this sort of format from Terraform itself, and they're able to actually post the sort of summary of the CI test in the pull request. So that's pretty nice there, a lot of success, but there is actually a failure as well. So if I look at, say, the details of one of these. So initially I've got a validation test, which basically runs through the linting for the code. This uses the super linter GitHub action, and it's targeted to Terraform and JSON, I believe. And then my CI test is really just a init and a plan of that code and targeted to the remote state. So that you can see there is actually an error here preventing this from being successful. Something about the scope being invalid. And that's the beauty of like doing tests and changes just before a demo, because I'm going to have to troubleshoot this later. But this, I just want to show you as well. Once I do merge this into my main branch, there is another job which does a continuous deployment. So here's a past pull request that I merged. That doesn't show my continuous deployment job, but if I go into actions, so this is my continuous deployment, and similar thing, it runs the validation first with the linting, and then it does in the apply as a secondary phase. So this is something you can set up today, even with Azure DevOps. You can set up this similar sort of structure to, do CI tests in your code as you merge it, just to validate that it's gonna not have any sort of linting problems or syntax problems. And then as you actually merge it to main, you can do an automatic deployment as well to different environments. How did that go? So I'll go back to my CLI here. Okay, so it says my ARM template change for exemptions worked. Awesome. And if I go to policy, look at my exemptions for critical infra. Okay, interesting. Now you can see it has selected the Windows related policies that we exempted through code, and it's no longer exempting the Linux related policies there from the assignment. So now what I probably have to do is run a state trigger. So policy, if you don't know, policy, the policy engine, huge scalable service in Azure, it has a timed trigger within itself, like an internal trigger for how it does and when and how soon it does compliance checks. So as you make changes, this compliance scan may not happen for 24 hours or an hour. So you can actually do a CLI action here to trigger a scan, and I like putting in the no wait parameter there, so I don't have to see or wait for that in my console. Now that's going to go do a scan. It's going to update our compliance for the critical infrastructure resource group. So right now, what we're seeing in this compliance view, we're seeing the old state. Once that scan completes, we will then see the updated state where there's non-compliant resources for these previously exempt policies, right? And that may take some time. So in the meantime, let me show you AZ Advertiser. Mentioned this before. This is a community-driven site. Basically, the creator is Julian Hayward. So he's a Microsoft consultant, architect, engineer, done some really great work with Azure Policy. I'm sure this is not his first project, but this site is my go-to when I want to see every single policy that's available, every single initiative, all the aliases as well. You can see the change states. So I can see yesterday there was a deletion for policy, and the day, maybe a few days before that, on the 13th of August, there was 5 new policies created. So if I go into aliases here, for example, now this site is a little bit chuggy. I'm pretty sure it's running on like the lowest specs possible because it's a free site. So you do have to be patient, but once it does work, it is brilliant. So the aliases, we can browse all the aliases available. This is not the only way to find aliases, of course. You can use PowerShell queries. You can use the Visual Studio Code Azure Policy extension as well to find aliases. And so here we can see, okay, these are all the namespaces. If I zoom in here, these are namespaces that you can filter on. These are resource types you can filter on. You can type in a string to search an alias as well. So it's a really useful kind of site if you're really into developing policies and seeing what's possible with these resource aliases. As I mentioned before, an alias it's a mapping. It's how policy maps to a certain property, and it makes it easy for the policy engine to find out what the status is, what the state is of that property as resources are changed in Azure. So so that's a good site. Yeah, definitely keep that one in mind. Let me go into refresh this compliance view here, see if I can get this working. Okay, logging governance for production again. And lo and behold, we now have non-compliant resources for those Linux-related policies that were previously exempt. So you can see I've got 3 exemptions. That's perfectly in line with my code that I did here in my repo. So this is using this policy exemptions. Currently, there's no Terraform resource for policy exemptions. So I've actually had to create my own sort of ARM template resource, which deploys the exemptions. It is publicly available for you to use. Now, what we can do now that these policies are not exempt anymore is we can actually run remediation here. So we can run, okay, from the portal. You can also do this through CLI. I'm going to do it through the portal at the moment. So we'll do Linux. And there's my one Linux VM. So this is, it's going to run that remediation. Maybe I'll do another one as well. Linux performance. I'll do the agent. Remediate that. So point and click stuff, you know, it's not really rocket science, but this is something, you know, you can offboard to your people to do as part of a change. You don't need to run this in business hours. You can schedule it after hours. The real thing to remember is policy is it's malleable. So you can run remediation on certain resources at a time, and you don't need to remediate everything at once, you know, depending on your scope of assignment. So definitely take that into consideration as well. If you want to maybe stagger the remediation, you probably want to deploy your policies to maybe resource group scope and production before deploying it to the entire subscription at once, you know, depending on how risky that change is. So now that's running. If I go to critical infra and just check, I'll just check, it's probably not done yet, but if I just check one of these production VMs and go to extensions, I've got Microsoft monitoring agent. That I believe is, yes. So that's the old, this is the MMA. What I'm looking for is the Azure monitor agent through our policy. So it's not there yet. There's most likely some sort of delay. And then the way I look at, you know, whether a policy has run on a resource group is I go into activity log and then look at, you know, I'm looking for those deploy if not exist operations there that I showed you at the start of the demo. So that's pretty much end-to-end deploy if not exist policies. And that's, you know, some automation capability. I've shown you the code as well. Certainly, I think, you know, this is something, if you want to manage, the good thing about managing policies as code is I can take this exact configuration, change a few variables, apply the same sort of governance at scale to other subscriptions, tenants, management groups as well. So, you know, it's kind of like a define once, use multiple times use case there. There is some effort to set up the structure and the framework. So you may not want to use all these different modules like I've done, but you may want to, you know, consolidate that into a single module if that makes your life easier. But certainly once you have the framework set up in managing policies as code, I think that's really going to be, you know, a really great reusable asset for your team. And you know, something that, you know, is certainly worth your time as well. You can make changes, of course, to resources not using Azure policy. So policy, I don't want to say it's the only, you know, governance tool out there. Many other governance tools, they all have their place. Policy has its place in a sense that, you know, it's a built-in service and it's got really a lot of power behind it through all these available resource aliases that, you know, over 38,000 in some insane number, it keeps growing. So let me refresh this activity log. Okay, so now you can see these deploy if not exist events appear, and they've both succeeded. And now if I look at my prod VM extension list, maybe that needs to be refreshed. But I am expecting to see the Azure Monitor agent appear. Eventually. one thing I have done as well, so I've got metric alerts, which I think I mentioned in the code before, and I've got these load balancers here. The metric alerts have been deployed using policy. So if I show hidden types, it's a bit hard to see because of so these metric alerts here, dip availability, VIP availability, there's 2 deployed per load balancer, and that's done by policy. So if I look at my metrics, no, if I look at my alerts in monitor, I should see some alert rules here. There we go. So every load balancer I deployed in my subscription, out of the box has all these metric alerts deployed as well. I didn't have to do anything because I already configured the policy to manage that for me. And if I look at the compliance of my policy that's doing that change, I believe it's monitoring governance. Yeah, so maybe if I look at events. Okay, so if I go to events with my monitoring governance initiative policy set, you can see here I've got a deploy count of 50. So it's deployed 50 metric alerts to my entire subscription, didn't have to do a thing. That's really the dynamic side of policy that I enjoy seeing, where you kind of define what guardrails you have for your environment. You know, maybe a resource needs a metric alert if it's in production. As new resources are created in your environment, if they don't have a metric alert, policy is going to deploy it for you. You don't even have to know about it. So, you know, you don't need to raise a ticket, you don't need to raise a change. It's done as part of the new resource deployment. And that's a lot of value to me. Now, where we can continue on, I think that's the gist of the demo that I wanted to show. Where we can continue on with this is some slides. So use cases, now that you've seen what policy is capable of, you should know there's so many use cases, too many to fit on, you know, a single slide here. I've listed some common ones here: data protection, tagging, network related stuff, you know, insane amount of network compliance that you should be doing there. Regulatory compliance as well, aligning to different frameworks like NIST, CIS, ISO. General compliance, like you want to restrict the SKUs that are used in your environment. You don't want to get some huge bill if someone's deployed something that's very costly. You can do that with policy. Allowed locations as well. You know, data sovereignty is a big thing. If your company or organization needs to only deploy into Australia East, Australia Southeast, Australia Central, you can restrict those deployments to those regions only using policy. Naming convention is possible as well. This is only really scratching the surface. You know, it's good to know a few common ones there. Effects and order of evaluation. It is important to know if you're managing Azure policy and troubleshooting Azure policy and even developing Azure policy. It's good to know kind of under the hood what's happening. So you can see here there's put and get requests, patch requests that get sent to the Azure Resource Manager. And then, you know, let's say you're creating a load balancer, that request is going to get sent to the load balancer resource provider. But during that request happening, before the resource actually gets created, the policy engine intercepts the deployment, and it does an evaluation of these effects if you have them in your policies. So if you've got disabled, modify, pen, deny, or audit, so it will evaluate those effects during the resource creation. Some effects happen after the resource creation. And that's what what you can see here of the audit if not exists, and also deploy if not exists, where I've deployed metric alerts, I've deployed the Azure Monitor Agent, the data collection rule. Those are deploy if not exist effects that happen after a delay of a new resource being created, because it's those resources are typically dependent on the parent resource, so they shouldn't happen at the same time and be evaluated at the same time as a new resource request, right? So typically there is I think it's default, the evaluation delay for deploy if not exists is 10 minutes. we now have the capability to reduce that by a huge amount, actually, depending on the resource type, with a certain property called evaluation delay. So you can put that in your JSON as code, and you can set it to a value, I think it's called after provisioning success. And what that will do is, instead of waiting 10 minutes after a new resource is provisioned before kicking off the deploy if not exist effect, that deploy if not exist effect will kick off as soon as the resource is provisioned. So that's probably going to save you. In my experience, it saved me about 8 minutes in terms of waiting for that deployment to happen. Good to know. Compliance and remediation. This is not my favorite slide because it's super busy. Basically, what I'm trying to communicate here is that there's scans happening, there's compliance checks that are kind of happening in the background with the policy engine. When you assign a new resource to a certain scope, that compliance check happens automatically, or you can kick that off through CLI, like I showed you maybe 15 minutes ago. You can also run remediation tasks, like I've shown you in ClickOps through the portal. And these results, every time you update the results of compliance for your resources, that gets sent back to the policy engine there through the results, and it's either compliant, which is green, or non-compliant, which is red. Anyways, tips. So custom policies here. One of the benefits I found with custom policies is you can set some metadata. The other thing I found is there's some custom policies where the mode is not correct. Microsoft recommends that you use the all mode in most cases here, and only use index mode, which is the other possibility, when you're managing tag related resources. So I think there's a good reason for that. If you want more information, hit me up. Leverage the metadata as well, because I found some use in that in setting the version of your custom policies, like you can see here, and the source. So the source is, where is my policy as code living? If I'm looking at this custom policy from the portal or through CLI, I want to know, okay, how do I make the change to it? Where do I go? So you can leverage the source key and put in the value of whatever you want there. Here I put in the repo name there. And yeah, so as code, this is actually bicep that you're seeing now. As code, this is what it looks like. Previous screen was what it looks like in the portal. So I've actually used the parameter for policy source. Okay, manage identity permissions. So a deploy if not exist policy uses that managed identity, like I explained before. If you don't manage the role assignments to create the managed identity role assignment for the policy assignment, your policy will not have permission to make the change to apply compliance. So here on the left, you can see this is a policy managed identity view where it's saying it doesn't have the right permissions because that bit is blank. On the right is where it has the right permissions and saying, okay, I've got contributor rights, that's all good. So, if you've got, deployment issues with permissions, you're trying to troubleshoot, why is my compliance not updating? Why are these deployments not working? One of the things I go to first is the policy assignment to check if the managed identity has the permissions. Maybe you don't have access to role assignments to be able to check role assignments in your tenant. But you can go to the policy assignment if you have access to that and check this area here. This is the role assignment that you can see on the screen. This is how I solve this problem as code. Like I mentioned before, just basically looking up, referencing the policy assignment principal ID that gets created, and then creating the role assignment as part of that flow. Custom deny messages are fairly new, I feel. Very important for deny policies. So where you are denying something from happening using the deny effect. Probably most people are not using custom deny messages, but you can do this as code. Bicep, Terraform, PowerShell, they all provide the capability now. So you can put something like this. So on the right, you can see where I've defined as code using some parameters and variables as well, what a custom deny message is, globally. So that's this top sort of block JSON. So that applies to every policy within the assignment. And then you can also leverage specific deny messages for specific policy definitions as well. And that's the second block here where I've used policy definition reference ID to target a specific policy. And I put in, a very custom, nice deny message here saying you're missing this specific tag, which is a parameter. So that's dynamic. Please update your resource to include the tag. Very simple. And that's on the bottom left here is what the user will actually see. In this case, it's the owner tag. So then they know, okay, if they might not be familiar with Azure policy to be able to read the JSON and interpret that. But if you have a custom deny message, such as what you can see, they have a good sense as, okay, I'm missing the owner tag, so I'll go put that in, and then they can retry again. Deploy if not exists, I've shown you this in great detail. This is kind of like a high level overview showing the ARM template element of it. So that's this below area here where, if you're familiar with ARM template, it's really nested within that policy JSON there. This is bicep as well. So initially we have the condition and the if statement. This is where, you set your qualification of what your non-compliant resource type is, whether it's a resource group, a storage account, Windows VM. The effect is always deploy if not exists. And then from then on, you set some things like the existence condition, which is what does compliant look like for this resource type. Permissions, I just want to cover this quickly as well. So, as you're doing things in production, as in a DevOps methodology, you won't be using your own account, I hope, to manage policies for production. You'll be using a service principal. So these are the common sort of built-in role assignments I've seen used for permissions for those service principals. And the scope is usually at tenant or management group level. And then as you go down the level of, responsibility here and skill set, you have less and less permissions as well needed. And the scope definitely does not need to be as high. So at the very lowest level, if you're just a policy reader, you can only see the policy. You won't be able to change anything. If you're a user, you would have contributor rights. If you're a developer, you need extra rights there to also manage resources, not just policies, I feel, from my experience. And so that's why contributor is there as well. Code deployment. Typically, you'll have a single repo, and as you do changes in feature branches, you can make changes to this is a multi-tenant model. Sorry, this is a multi-tenant model of what you're seeing. So there's one tenant production at the top, another tenant in non-production at the bottom. You may not have multi-tenants, but if you did, this is how you might deploy your policy code before that code gets merged to the main branch. So you can do a non-prod stage deploying to different scopes here. And then after you deploy to main, then maybe there's an automatic deployment job or a manual job to deploy out to your production tenant there. But it's super, super important, I feel, to test any new policy deployment. If you don't have a non-production tenant, maybe you want to use this sort of model where it's a single tenant, but you have multiple management groups, multiple subscriptions in that tenant. You can deploy your new policies in the non-prod stage. You can deploy them to those specific management groups and subscriptions, and even you can scope it to a resource group if you wanted to. The important thing to know here is policy definitions, policy sets. So those sort of resources, they can only get deployed to a subscription level and management group level, but the actual policy assignment can get scoped to a resource group level. So sorry if that's not clear on this sort of diagram here. Yeah, so this is single tenant model. Now, after this session, hopefully I haven't overwhelmed you if you know nothing about policy, but if you are interested, I've put some, ideas here as to, brainstorming what you can do next. If you're really interested in getting into policy, it's a very, don't want to oversell it, but to me, it's a very exciting field because it touches on every single possible resource in Azure at an infrastructure level. And the more you know about how policy works, the more you understand the resource aliases and what you can do with them in terms of crafting policies and applying compliance as code. You just become a more skilled a skilled engineer. I feel like I've learned so much in the past year just working on policy and diving into different possibilities there, and it's challenging. So certainly this bottom level here, these are kind of I would rate them as sort of easy level things if you're just starting out with policy development. Middle layer, look to group your policies into initiatives for assignment. Look at using CI/CD tasks in your code deployment. Look at custom deny messages, and then the hardest here, I feel maybe you want to use some bicep snippets. Look at reviewing your existing policy repos if you have them. Look at improving those to make them more reusable and scalable, and look at non-compliance alerting as well, and remediation flows, which are kind of value adds, I feel, outside of the standard policy management. Yeah, so that's really the gist of it. I hope I didn't go over time, but thanks for joining me.
Awesome. Thank you, Jesse. We do have a couple of questions pop up in the chat, and if you've got other questions, feel free to pop up with them now, but I'll relay the ones that were asked earlier. So we have one from Prem asking about Terraform versus ARM template. Which one is good and why for Azure?
Terraform versus ARM template. Yeah. In terms of managing policy resources, look, ARM templates have been around forever, as far as I'm concerned. Even certainly since the early days of ARM before ASM, and there's so much IP and there's so much examples of ARM templates out there. There's a lot of community development for ARM templates, so you can find a lot of existing code, I feel, for ARM templates and reusable code as well. The problem with ARM templates I see is that they get very complex at scale, and if you're looking to have a team of developers that manage Azure policy, you probably want to lower the level in terms of difficulty a bit, in terms of getting them up and running with policies and managing that as code. So for me, it's a tough question because I use ARM templates, as you've seen, myself, and they're kind of like a necessary evil sometimes. You don't get away from them, even though you might want to. It's really dependent on your unique situation there.
Yeah, that's a great answer. There's one other question in the chat as well from Mehmet asking, with the remediation applying to the existing resources, does it actually remove or alter any of those existing resources that do not comply with the policy content?
Remediation of existing resources, does it remove resources not compliant? No, it doesn't. So the policy definition, unless maybe, like, I haven't run into this, it's an interesting question, but what if maybe in the policy definition for deploy if not exists effect, you've got a nested ARM template, right? And typically you're going to use the incremental mode for that nested ARM template, but maybe use complete mode. And in complete mode, I would hope you never use that, but that would destroy, I think, everything that was in the resource group for that resource as it was run. But in my experience, I've always used incremental mode. Running a remediation for a non-compliant resource only applied what I had missing that was part of my policy definition. So it didn't delete anything that was, in the resource group.
Awesome. All right, I don't see any more questions in the chat, but if folks want to vocalize any of those questions, now is the time.
Yeah, hit me up.
Brilliant. Going. Let's see, anybody unmuting? Gone. All right. Thank you so much, Jesse. That was super in depth and you covered a huge amount of ground. So I really, really appreciated it. We'll get a video posted of this as well, so you can refer back to it after the fact. Because as I said, there was a lot of content and it was super, super deep and interesting. So I'm sure lots of people want to be able to refer back to it. One last thing before we wrap up tonight. Next meetup is going to be in September. It's always the third Thursday of the month. We are looking for speakers. So if you've been inspired by something that you saw tonight, feel free to hit me up through Meetup or directly via email. After this, we would love to have you speak. It doesn't have to be a super in-depth and long session like Jesse's either. It could just be a short lightning talk of 5-10 minutes, even shorter than that if you want.
Lindsay?
Yes.
Hi. Would you mind if I ask you a question about the previous sessions? Where can I get the previous session videos? Can I get it in YouTube or some other?
Yeah,
one?
so the ones that we have recorded, you can find them up on YouTube. Generally, I link through to them on the Meetup page. If you go back to a previous Meetup and you can't find a video for it, may have slipped through the cracks, so just leave a comment on that Meetup. I will see it and I'll double check if there's a video for it or not.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Not
Thank
a
you, Lindsay.
problem. All right. Well, that's it. Thank you very much. And we're not going to see you online in August. There's some weird caching issues happening with the slides today. We'll see you online in September. Stay safe, get vaccinated, and see you soon.
Thanks, Lindy. Cheers.